Hello everyone and welcome to another IT Hero session here. In today's tutorial we are going to go through the process of actually creating a brand new group policy object and specifying some settings for it. In our particular case right now we are going to go through and enable biometric login for our domain users to allow them to be able to use biometric logons on devices that support them. Of course, this is a lot of modern laptops come with fingerprint readers. There's also other types of biometric authentication that is starting to gain some popularity, such as facial recognition and potentially a few others out there. But to Microsoft and Active Directory, it's just called biometric authentication. And we're going to go through and create a group policy to accept the credentials from biometric authentication in our environment here. So we're going to go ahead and get started here on our domain controller, where the first thing we need to make sure that we are already logged on as an administrator account, in which case on this particular environment, I'm just logged in with the default administrator. So of course this account is going to have all the access that's needed, but you will need to have a domain admin account or an account that has delegated permission to be able to go through and create and modify group policy objects to go through and complete this process here today. So keep that in mind, that if you get any errors or access denied, it might be just a matter of not having the credentials to simply go through this process. So since we do know that we are logged on with an administrator account, I'm going to go ahead and open up our group policy management console here. I'm just going to do that by just typing the word group into the search, and the same thing applies to every modern server operating system out there. Just simply open up the group policy management console. And when we do that, we're brought over to our group policy management area here. And in our small little area here, what we're going to be doing is simply going through and creating a new group policy and applying it to our IT computers OU in Active Directory. So there's a couple of different ways you can go through and actually create a group policy object. So for example, if we wanted to, we could just open our group policy objects directory right here. We could right click, say new, and go through the whole process there. And then once that policy is created, we can link that policy to whatever OUs that it's needed. I prefer typically to go through and actually create the group policy at the OU level where I plan on using it, as this not only creates the policy but links it to the location where it's actually going to be applied. One side note of all this is I will be going through in this particular setup of creating this policy and applying it directly to this OU, but in any kind of production environment, you should always undergo some kind of testing procedures before implementing a group policy that's going to affect users, workstations, servers, anything in the environment. Testing is always a great idea to go through and do with group policies, just because it seems like a set of simple settings and is very straightforward for the most part. There could be unintended consequences, such as a conflict with another group policy, or maybe some kind of application or some process that a user is doing that is impacted by that group policy. And if you're going through and simply creating a group policy and applying it to a whole group of users and computers and it causes problems, all of a sudden you're the guy that's getting all the fingers pointed at them, and it's always best not to be that guy. So in our case here, we're going to go ahead and create this group policy object and apply it to this OU, but in production, should always go through and do this with a test OU, verify that it's applying and working as expected, and then simply link that tested group policy to your production OUs at that point. So just a side note, getting a little bit off track there, but very important information. We're going to proceed with our process here by selecting this top option here, create a GPO in this domain, and link it here. And I'm going to call this particular policy enable biometric. Spell it right, of course. Now, when you're going through creating a new group policy object, there is this option right here of source starter GPO. So a lot of people don't realize really what this function is, what its purpose is, and just kind of ignore it and don't use it. And for the most part, that's exactly what I recommend that you do. The reason for that is that a starter GPO means that it is a group policy object template. So it's effectively a group policy that has a lot of settings to it already specified that we can set as a template to create this new group policy, and that template would create a lot of policy settings in this to save us some time and trouble. So if for whatever reason we're having to go through the process of creating multiple group policies for different but very similar purposes, in that case, maybe a starter GPO is actually going to be useful and helpful for you, because you can create that starter GPO with the common settings that's going to be applied to those different computers, users, groups, however you plan on doing it. And then as far as the individual settings that are needed but between those users, computers, however you're applying it, you can simply make those adjustments on each policy you create, but the main settings are already in place and created by that starter GPO. Personally, I have never actually found a viable use for the starter GPOs in group policy management, because even in the case of needing to create multiple group policies with very similar settings, I've always gone through the process of simply creating one group policy object with the common settings, exporting those, and then importing those settings on any subsequent new group policies that I create to get those settings, and then adjusting from there. If you check our channel, you'll actually see a video where we go through the entire process of exporting and importing group policy objects. So that's not a difficult process. I could see that as being a little bit more step cumbersome than just using a starter GPO, but I think it's a pretty one-off situation where starter GPOs are useful. So in general, I just don't recommend worrying about this option at all. So we're going to create our policy. It's just going to be called enable biometric. We're going to hit OK. And with that, we've actually just created a group policy object. It is here, it is applied to the IT computers domain, it is active and ready to go. However, if we look at the settings for this group policy object right now, it's just a blank page, because that's what happens when you create a brand new group policy object. We still need to give the actual settings and give this group policy some kind of a purpose. So after creating the group policy itself, we're going to go ahead and right click on it, and we're going to choose Edit to open the Group Policy Management Editor. And here, this is where we get into the real settings that this group policy is going to be applying to whatever users, computers, the OU that we link to. This is the actual settings that the group policy is going to control for us. In our particular case, since we're looking to enable biometric settings, what we are going to do is we're going to go into the administrative templates section in the group policy management editor, which is what I always recommend most people spend most of their time in group policy. Your administrative templates actually cover just about everything that you could possibly want to do for group policy. So administrative templates is basically just all set up, ready to go, and so that is where most of the time you will spend your time. I'm going to go into Windows components in our particular case here, and we have an easy option right here of biometrics. So let me go ahead and full screen this window so you can see all of the options for this. So the first thing we want to do, allow the use of biometrics. So we're going to double click that setting. We're going to go to enabled, and we'll say OK. And then in our environment here, since this is an Active Directory domain, and I want our domain users to be able to log on with their biometric credentials, I'm going to go to this setting as well. And I'm going to go to enabled, and I'm going to say OK. Very simple. We've just created a group policy object. We just specified a couple of settings to allow biometrics here, and this is actually already in effect. It's ready to go. So if I go back over to group policy management here and I refresh, now we see this is no longer a blank page. If I hit show all here, we can see those two settings that we just specified in the group policy management editor. With that, we have completely just created a brand new group policy object. We have applied it to an OU, and now all computers in this particular OU here, IT computers, are going to begin receiving this setting. Now, another important note to keep in mind is the difference when you're creating a group policy object of computer configuration versus user configuration. You're going to notice here, if I go back over to the group policy management editor, that these are actually divided up within the editor as well, computer configuration and user configuration. And the reason is because a group policy can either apply to computer settings or to user settings. And depending on how you go through and apply that, you may need one, the other, or potentially some combination of both to accomplish the goal that you need. So in our particular case, we're enabling biometric authentication on all the computers in the IT computers OU here, meaning that any user that logs on to these computers, since this is being applied at the computer level, they will be able to log on with biometric settings. Now, in the case here, if we needed to prevent certain users from going through and using biometric for whatever reason, then we might need to go through and create a separate group policy object, or potentially even just put a filter on this group policy object that prevents certain users from having this applied to them. And all of that goes into the nitty-gritty details of group policies and setting scopes, delegations, and security filtering. But for our purposes here today, all we simply needed to do is create this object, set up the settings for it, apply it to the OU, and then now this is where it will start to roll out to all the systems in the IT computers domain, OU in this domain, and those systems will allow biometric logon. It is as simple as that for creating any kind of new group policy object. But once again, as always, I'm going to remind you, test, test, test. Verify that you can go through and actually log on using biometrics if this is something that you want to enable by applying this just to a single computer. Make sure that it's not going to cause any issues, or that you're not going to have any applications that are going to experience problems or not accepting this logon, or maybe you have some other security application that maybe won't even allow biometric logon to take place. There's so many different factors that can go into if a group policy works that I cannot stress enough the importance of testing a group policy before rolling it out into a production environment. But this is how you create a new group policy object and specify a few settings on this. I hope this is helpful. If it was, please like and subscribe, and check out other videos on our channel. Until next time, continue being an IT hero.